Do you believe a dog can resist a programmed kill command? Rocky is not just any dog. He was once a canine military dog, trained to be fearless, unwavering, and without a choice. But when he was turned into a heartless killing machine, he did something no one expected. He fought back. This isn't just a story about a dog. It's a battle for freedom, loyalty, and a place to call home. If you love heartwarming stories about the loyalty of German Shepherds and meaningful life lessons, don't forget to subscribe to Dog Stories now. Every subscription is a huge motivation for us to keep creating inspiring content, and we truly appreciate it. Thank you so much. And now let's follow Rocky on his extraordinary journey. Mason Ryan pulled his worn-out coat tighter around him as the biting wind from the Wyoming mountains swept through. Late autumn was colder than usual, but he had grown used to the harshness of this place. A year ago, he chose to leave behind the chaos of the world and retreat to a small farm far from town. No distractions, no memories of war haunting his mind. Today, he found himself at an animal auction in Riverton. Stray dogs, abused animals, or those deemed no longer valuable were brought here, hoping for a second chance at a home. Mason had no intention of adopting. He didn't want attachments. But then his eyes landed on a metal cage, set apart from the others. Inside was a German Shepherd, thin and ragged, its fur matted with dirt. Its ribs jutted out beneath taut skin, old scars still marking its body. But what caught Mason's attention wasn't the scars, it was the eyes. No fear, no aggression, just pure, calculated vigilance. German Shepherd about 3 years old, the auction handler muttered, flipping through his notes. His voice was indifferent. No one wants him. Got returned twice already. Not exactly friendly. Mason didn't ask any more questions. He saw something in this dog, a sense of familiarity he couldn't quite explain. When the auction ended, he left with a leash and a nameless dog. Back at the ranch, Mason opened the truck door, but the dog didn't move. It watched him, dark brown eyes locked onto his, studying, assessing. "Come on," Mason said, his voice low but not commanding. The dog remained still. 1 second, 2. Then slowly it stepped down, each movement deliberate, calculated. Mason didn't try to touch it. He understood dogs with military training. If this one really had been through that kind of conditioning, any sudden moves wouldn't be welcomed. So instead, he simply walked away, leaving the decision up to the dog, to follow or not. Within seconds, Mason heard the sound of footsteps crunching against the dirt. It was following him, but it kept a safe distance. "Good," Mason muttered. 3 days passed, and Mason quickly realized this dog was anything but ordinary. No one had to train it, yet it never ate right away when given food. It always waited for a signal. It never turned its back on Mason, keeping him in its line of sight at all times. And most notably, it never fully slept. Every time Mason entered the room, its ears twitched slightly, always on alert. The dog didn't attack, didn't show aggression, but it didn't trust Mason either. Something in its past had taught it one thing: humans were not to be trusted. Mason studied the old scars across the dog's body, a deep groove around its neck, like it had once worn something tight, constricting. A scar on its front leg, thin and clean, left by a blade or some sharp object. These weren't the usual wounds of a house pet. This dog had been through something much worse. One evening, while checking on Rocky, the name Mason had unconsciously called him since day one, his fingers brushed along the dog's ribs and felt a small bump beneath the skin. "A microchip. You belonged to someone once," he murmured, knowing full well Rocky couldn't answer. But the moment Mason touched the chip, Rocky tensed. His body shivered slightly, and his eyes darkened. There was a secret buried in this dog's past. A secret Mason didn't know yet, but sooner or later it would come to light. Mason Ryan sat on the front steps of his ranch, watching the German Shepherd standing just a few meters away. Rocky didn't run, but he also didn't come closer. He stood there, silent, watchful, like a shadow. It had been days since Mason brought him home from the auction, and still not much had changed. Rocky wouldn't let anyone touch him. He kept his distance, always staying just out of reach. But at least he had stopped trying to run away. And that was a start. Today, Madison Reyes, the local veterinarian and one of Mason's few friends, pulled up in her silver pickup truck. She stepped out, carrying a medical bag and the sharp, knowing gaze of someone who had seen too many broken animals. "Another stray, Mason?" she teased. But the moment her eyes landed on Rocky, she fell silent. It only took one look for Madison to realize this dog was anything but ordinary. Mason kept his distance, giving her space to approach Rocky. Madison didn't crouch, didn't reach out too quickly. She knew better. With animals that had been through harsh training, even the slightest movement could be seen as a threat. She observed for a moment before speaking. "Do you know what this dog is?" Mason nodded. "I suspect he was military." Madison slowly nodded. "Not just military. Look at the scar on his front leg and the way he balances when he stands. He wasn't just a regular K9, he was a special operations dog." Mason wasn't surprised, but this information only made him more curious. "What about the chip under his skin?" he asked. Madison frowned. "We can check, but if he was a special operations dog, that chip might have been wiped or altered." When she moved to get closer, Rocky took a cautious step back, but he didn't growl. Madison didn't push him. "This is going to take time," she said. "He doesn't trust anyone." After Madison left, Mason knew he couldn't force Rocky to accept him. If this dog had served in the military, chances were he had been betrayed. He had to do things differently. Mason decided to try something unusual. No commands, no pressure. He would let Rocky choose. That night, he left the front door open. He didn't call Rocky inside. He didn't leave food just beyond the threshold to lure him in. He simply sat down in his chair, opened a book, and waited. Rocky stood in the yard, his eyes fixed on the open doorway. He looked at Mason, then at the dark interior of the house. Thinking. 10 minutes passed, 20. Finally, Rocky stepped onto the porch, but he didn't go inside. Instead, he lay down just outside the door. Still keeping his distance, but for the first time choosing to be closer to Mason rather than staying in the safety of space. It wasn't surrender. It was the first step toward trust. The next day, Mason was repairing the fence near the tree line when a gunshot echoed in the distance. Boom! Rocky immediately sprang to his feet. Mason stopped what he was doing, watching Rocky's reaction. He waited to see what the dog would do. An abused dog would panic and run. A battle-worn dog would attack on instinct. But Rocky did neither. Instead, he turned his head, searching for Mason. Then, slowly, he stepped closer. He didn't touch him, but he stood beside him, ears pricked, body tense. He didn't run. Mason slowly crouched down, meeting Rocky's gaze for the first time with nothing between them. "You're choosing to stay?" he whispered. Rocky didn't answer, but he didn't leave either. For the first time since being rescued, he didn't just watch Mason from a distance. He sought him out in a moment of uncertainty. Trust had begun to take root, a call that changed everything. That afternoon, Mason's phone rang. Madison's voice was tense. "Mason, I just ran a check through the military database. There's a problem." Mason frowned. "What kind of problem?" Mason Ryan tightened his grip on the phone as Madison's voice came through the line. "I can't find any record of Rocky in the retired military K9 database." Mason's voice tensed. "Maybe the system hasn't been updated?" Madison paused, then lowered her voice. "No, that's not it. His records were erased." The world around Mason seemed to freeze. Erased? There's no trace of him in the military database, but I did find another report about dogs that disappeared after being discharged from service. A chill ran down Mason's spine. Rocky wasn't just another abandoned dog. Someone had deliberately erased him from the system. And just hours later, Mason realized he wasn't the only one interested in Rocky. "A stranger appears." A sound came from the entrance. Mason turned his head. A sleek black sedan was rolling up the dirt road toward his ranch, moving slowly, deliberately. The driver didn't get out right away when the car stopped just outside the gate. Rocky stiffened, ears pricking forward. Mason silently lowered his hand to his waist, where he always carried his pistol. The car door finally opened, and a man stepped out, too polished. A dark suit, spotless leather shoes that had never seen a dirt road. He didn't belong here. "Good afternoon." The man smiled, a polite, practiced expression, but his eyes were sharp as a blade. Mason said nothing, just watched him. Rocky let out a low, warning growl. The man raised his hand slightly in a gesture of peace. "My name is Richard Hale. I represent an organization that trains working dogs. We're always looking for exceptional canines, and we're willing to pay generously." His gaze dropped to Rocky. "And I hear you have a very special one." Mason kept his expression neutral. "Who told you that?" Richard smirked. "We have our sources." Rocky, right? We're prepared to make you a significant offer to acquire him." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a blank check, just waiting for a number to be written. Mason crossed his arms. "He's not for sale." "You haven't heard my offer." "I don't need to." Richard's smile faded. For the first time, he dropped the polite act, and his true expression surfaced, cold, calculating. "Do you even know what you're holding on to?" His voice was lower now, stripped of any friendliness. Mason's jaw tightened. "A dog." Richard let out a quiet chuckle, humorless, sharp. He adjusted his collar, exhaling like he was dealing with someone foolish. "You're in possession of something that doesn't belong to you, Mason. If I were you, I'd think carefully about that." Richard turned away and walked back toward his car. But just before getting in, he spoke one last time, without looking back. "Some people don't give up easily, Mason. We'll be back." Then the car sped off, kicking up a thin cloud of dust that slowly faded into the evening light. Rocky kept growling, his body tense like a coiled spring. Mason placed a hand on his head. For the first time, Rocky didn't pull away. "Yeah, I've got the same feeling, buddy." Mason stepped inside, but the unease didn't leave him. That night, while checking the perimeter of the ranch, he spotted a black SUV parked far down the main road, lights off, watching. Mason didn't like this. He went inside, locked every door, checked his gun, then sat down. Rocky didn't sleep. He stayed close to the window, eyes fixed on the darkness outside. Mason wasn't the only one who sensed danger. Rocky knew it too. The next morning, Mason's phone rang. "Did you have a visitor last night?" Madison's voice was tense. "Yeah, some guy named Richard Hale." There was a pause on the other end. "Mason, I checked the database for military working dog training facilities. There's no Richard Hale working for any legitimate organization." "Not surprising," Mason replied. "I think I know where he's really from." Madison hesitated, then continued. "A friend of mine from the military just sent me a message. There was a classified military program shut down 2 years ago, a unit that specialized in training elite special ops dogs. But when the program was shut down, some of the dogs disappeared." She paused before saying the one thing Mason didn't want to hear. "And Rocky might be one of them." Mason stood by the window, eyes locked on the open field stretching beyond the ranch. The sunset burned red along the horizon, but his mind was still replaying Madison's words. "The dogs from that program, they're disappearing." Those words wouldn't let him sit still. Mason glanced down at Rocky, lying near the door, his brown eyes still open, still alert. They had come to his doorstep asking to buy him. This wasn't going to stop. Right then, the distant rumble of an approaching vehicle echoed down the dirt road. Mason turned, his hand instinctively resting on his pistol. A silver sedan rolled into the ranch, moving slowly, deliberately. And when the woman stepped out of the driver's seat, everything changed. She had dark brown hair pulled back, her face etched with exhaustion, like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. "Are you Mason Ryan?" Mason nodded, his eyes flicking to the envelope she was gripping tightly in her hand. "I'm Sarah Whitmore." She hesitated, as if trying to steady herself. "My husband, Sebastian Caleb, served in the military. He passed away over a year ago." Mason said nothing. He didn't know her, but the name Sebastian Caleb wasn't unfamiliar. Sarah's gaze shifted downward to Rocky. The moment she saw him sitting quietly by Mason's side, she froze. Her hands trembled slightly. "Oh my God, he's one of them." The air around them seemed to go still. Mason stepped down from the porch, locking eyes with Sarah. "What do you know about him?" Sarah took a deep breath, then handed him the envelope she had been gripping so tightly. "My husband left this before he died. I think you need to read it." Inside the house, Mason carefully opened the envelope. The paper was old, but the handwriting was sharp, precise. "Mason, if you're reading this, I'm probably already gone. Something is very wrong with the program we served in. They weren't training these dogs to protect. They were training them to kill. And when one of them no longer met the standard, they turned them into test subjects. I tried to report it, but they silenced me. Jonathan Graves, he's the one in charge. If you ever come across any of the dogs from this program, protect them. They saved us. Now it's our turn to save them." The name Jonathan Graves felt like a blade slicing through Mason's past. Graves had once been a commander in a classified military K-9 program, but the rumors Mason had heard about him were anything but ordinary. He didn't just train dogs to fight, he turned them into killing machines. And Rocky wasn't just any dog. He had once belonged to Graves. Mason looked up at Sarah. "How long have you had this letter?" Sarah clenched her fists. "Over a year. I was afraid to open it. But when I heard about you and about this dog, I knew I had to find you." Mason read the letter again. He didn't need to ask if Rocky was connected to this. He already had his answer. Because the moment he said Jonathan Graves aloud, Rocky changed. His body went rigid, ears pricked. His eyes widened, pupils contracting, as if he had just heard a command he could never forget. But the terrifying part wasn't fear. It was the fury burning in his gaze. A deep, rumbling growl escaped Rocky's throat. Not the growl of a scared dog, the growl of a warrior remembering his enemy. "Rocky," Mason whispered, but the dog didn't hear him. The name Graves awakened something deep inside Rocky, a buried memory. He was no longer the frightened, broken dog Mason had brought home from the auction. He was a survivor, and now he remembered. Mason turned to Sarah. "What else do you know?" Sarah nodded. "After Sebastian Caleb died, I tried to reach out to the people who served with him. One of them, a man named Cooper, told me that the dogs from that program are being hunted." A cold chill ran down Mason's spine. If they're no longer military assets, they shouldn't be the government's problem anymore. Sarah shook her head. "That's not it." She pulled a thin folder from her bag. "Cooper sent me this." Mason flipped it open. Veterinary reports, death certificates. Every document had one thing in common. These dogs hadn't died from old age, not from illness. They had been eliminated. Mason narrowed his eyes as he turned to the last page. A list of deceased dogs, each with their serial number. He scanned the list, searching for Rocky's chip ID. It wasn't there, which meant Rocky might be one of the last ones left. And if they were being hunted, Rocky was the next target. Mason clenched his fists. They wanted to cover their tracks. They wanted to erase Rocky like the others. Not a chance. He crouched down, placing a hand on Rocky's back, and for the first time, the dog didn't pull away. "I don't know what you've been through," Mason murmured, "but I swear I won't let them touch you." Rocky met his gaze, and in that moment, two warriors understood each other. No longer a broken dog and a lost Marine. They were a team. Mason Ryan sat by the fireplace, eyes fixed on Sebastian Caleb's letter. He had read it over and over, yet the weight of its words never lessened. Jonathan Graves, he's the one in charge. That name wasn't unfamiliar to Mason. Graves had been one of the most ruthless commanders Mason had ever heard of in the military. But now, he wasn't just a name from the past. He was back. And he was looking for Rocky. Outside, the night stretched on. The silence was so deep that Mason could hear the wind sweeping across the fields. Rocky lay near the window, his eyes still open, watching the darkness. This dog never slept deeply. And maybe that was why he sensed danger before Mason did. It was close to 2 a.m. when Mason felt the shift in the air. He didn't hear anything unusual, but Rocky did. The dog was completely still, ears pricked, eyes locked on something beyond the window. Then he growled. Not an ordinary growl, a warning. Mason's hand instinctively went to his gun as he rose slowly, scanning the darkness outside. From here, everything looked normal. But if Rocky was reacting, that meant something was out there. Silently, Mason reached for the light switch and flicked it off. The room plunged into darkness, but his eyes adjusted quickly. He drew his Glock, stepped toward the window, and held his breath. Crack. A faint sound outside, not the wind. Someone was moving. Mason gestured for Rocky to fall back, but the dog didn't budge. He stood firm, muscles coiled, ready. Then a faint red beam flickered across the window. Infrared. Mason didn't hesitate. He dropped to one knee, gun aimed at the window, heart pounding. They were here. Just as he was about to move, the back door burst open. Two figures rushed in. Quick, tactical, efficient. Operatives. Mason didn't wait for them to make the first move. He pulled the trigger. The bullet ripped through the air, forcing one of them to dive sideways. Rocky launched forward before Mason could even react. The German Shepherd tore through the air like an arrow, leaping up and clamping his jaws around the intruder's arm. The man crashed to the ground, screaming as Rocky's razor-sharp teeth sank deep into his bicep. The second man snapped his gun up immediately, aimed straight at Rocky, but Mason was faster. Bang! The bullet ripped through the man's shoulder, throwing him off balance. Less than 10 seconds. That's all it took for Mason and Rocky to take them both down. But they weren't alone. Outside, an engine roared to life. There were more of them. The man trapped beneath Rocky's jaws screamed in pain, but within moments, both intruders were retreating. Mason didn't chase. This wasn't a kill mission. They weren't here to take him out. They were testing his response. He caught a glimpse of them disappearing into the night just seconds before he could fire again. But what unsettled Mason most wasn't that they got away. It was what they left behind. Rocky remained in attack stance, fur bristling, body coiled, ready for another fight. But Mason's eyes locked onto his neck. There was a small black device embedded beneath Rocky's fur near his shoulder. A tracker. Mason pulled out his knife and carefully removed it. The moment he pried it loose, a tiny red light blinked to life. The signal had been activated. Mason's jaw tightened. They had been tracking Rocky from the very beginning, which meant they had known their location this entire time. Mason threw the tracker onto the table, his eyes darkening. They didn't just want Rocky, they wanted to see how he would react, and that meant this was only the beginning. Mason turned to Rocky, who stood firm beside him, waiting for a command. He had no choice. He had to move before it was too late. Mason Ryan picked up the tracker from the table, watching as the blinking red light slowly faded, its battery nearly dead. The feeling of being hunted was no longer just a distant fear. They had come to his doorstep, and next time they wouldn't just be testing him. He glanced at Rocky, the German shepherd still standing beside him, sharp eyes tracking every movement in the room. Rocky wasn't afraid, but he understood what was happening. Mason took a deep breath. There was only one way to protect Rocky and himself: strike before they could. And to do that, he needed information. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he never thought he'd call again. After a few rings, a low, steady voice came through the line. "Ryan, you just called an unofficial FBI line. Who found you?" Mason didn't waste time. "I'm not calling for small talk, Cross. I need intel on Jonathan Graves." Silence stretched for a few seconds. "Why the hell are you asking about him?" Cross's tone sharpened. "Because he just sent people to kill me." "Your location's been compromised?" Mason glanced down at the tracker on the table. "I think they traced Rocky." Cross's demeanor shifted instantly. "Rocky? You're telling me you have one of Graves's dogs?" "Looks like it." This time, there was no hesitation in Cross's voice. "Ryan, you have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. Those dogs from Graves's program aren't just retired military canines. They're living proof of crimes that a lot of people want buried." Mason clenched his fist. "I need to know the full truth." Cross let out a long breath before speaking. "We've been tracking this for over a year," Cross said. "Graves wasn't just training military dogs. He was experimenting with psychological control, turning them into living weapons." Mason felt his stomach tighten. "I saw how Rocky reacted when he heard Graves's name," Mason muttered. "He doesn't just remember, he hates him." Cross continued. "Any dog that didn't meet the standard or showed signs of resisting training was eliminated. But instead of being retired like protocol demands, they just disappeared." "You mean they were executed?" "That's what we believe. We found evidence that over 30 dogs from Graves' program were removed under the pretense of illness or behavioral issues." A slow burn of anger spread through Mason's chest. "Is Rocky the last one still alive?" Cross hesitated. "We're not sure, but if you have him, I can tell you one thing: Graves isn't gonna stop." Mason tightened his grip on the phone. "Then what's our move?" Cross let out a small chuckle. "I like how you said our. I've got a plan, but first, you and your dog need to be ready." Mason hung up and turned to Rocky. If Rocky had ever been a weapon, then starting today, he would be something else. A true partner. Rocky had always acted on trained instinct, following orders, not trust. But this time, Mason would teach him to rely on his own instincts. Not out of fear, out of choice. Mason stepped outside as the sky began to lighten. He placed a dry branch on the ground, then gestured for Rocky to hold his position. Stepping back a few meters, he locked eyes with the dog. "Rocky, find your target." For a moment, Rocky tensed, like old memories were pulling him back. But then, instead of charging forward on autopilot, he hesitated. He looked at Mason. Then he chose his own approach. He wasn't just following orders anymore. He was thinking. Mason nodded in satisfaction. This was how a true warrior operated. After an entire day of training, Mason returned to the house and gathered everything he had. He had been hunted long enough. This time, he would strike first. Mason called Cross back. "Tell me your plan." Cross paused for a moment before answering. "We know Graves is hosting a punishment training program. You interested?" Mason let out a cold chuckle. "I don't just want in. I want to end this." Rocky rose to his feet as Mason prepared to move. No hesitation, no doubt, they were ready. Mason Ryan stood beside his pickup truck, parked in the shadows, eyes locked on the covert training facility ahead. Halogen floodlights from the perimeter fence cut through the darkness, illuminating concrete buildings, a vast training field, and rows of steel kennels. He took a slow, steady breath, gripping Rocky's leash, though he knew the dog didn't need it. Rocky stood motionless, ears perked, gaze sharp. He understood what this meant. Through the earpiece, Cross's voice crackled to life. "I've infiltrated their security system. You've got about 20 minutes before the patrol shift changes." "Plenty," Mason replied. Cross continued. "Once you're inside, find any data on the experiment. We need evidence to shut this down for good." Mason didn't respond. He simply looked down at Rocky. "Ready, buddy?" Rocky blinked once, then moved alongside Mason as they advanced into Graves's den. Mason stayed low, skirting the edges of the compound, keeping away from the floodlights and watchtowers. He had infiltrated far worse places than this, but never with a dog by his side. Rocky didn't need commands. He read the environment on his own, moving silently through the darkness, like he was retrieving memories buried deep in his training. Mason reached the kennel area. A chorus of barking erupted from inside, but something was wrong. The dogs weren't just barking. They were screaming. Mason pressed against the metal fencing and peered inside. A shiver crawled down his spine. Inside the steel enclosures, dogs were chained to the walls. Skin clung to their bones. Their eyes were hollow, vacant, like their spirits had been ground to dust. One dog let out a weak whimper when it saw Mason, but it didn't move. It was afraid to. Mason turned to Rocky, but Rocky was frozen. His body trembled, silent and still. He knew this place. He remembered. It was in a place like this that they had turned him into a weapon. Mason swallowed his anger and shifted his focus to a larger building ahead. Through the glass windows, he could see the faint blue glow of computer screens. "The control center," he whispered. "Let's go, Rocky." Mason slipped inside, avoiding the security cameras. Inside the control room, rows of monitors displayed biometric data on the dogs. And then, on one of the screens, a name appeared. Rocky, subject to number 042. They were still tracking him. Mason moved fast, downloading the files onto a hard drive. His eyes scanned the system, searching for more. Then he found it. A file marked Project Rex, Neural Control Experiment. This was the proof Cross needed. But just as Mason was about to leave, a video feed on one of the monitors caught his eye. Graves was creating killers. The screen displayed a training room. A dog stood motionless inside, its eyes blank, empty. A man stood in front of it, Graves. "Begin the test," Graves said. A technician pressed a button on the control panel. Suddenly, the dog convulsed violently. Its empty stare shifted, instantly replaced by pure savage aggression. It let out a feral growl, then lunged at a training dummy, ripping into it with uncontrollable fury. Graves watched, unimpressed. "The program is working." Mason's fists clenched. They weren't just training these dogs, they were controlling them, turning them into emotionless killing machines. A sharp beep echoed from the console. Mason whipped around. The screen flashed. "Warning. Intrusion detected." "Damn it." Mason yanked the hard drive from the console and signaled Rocky to move. Outside, floodlights blazed on. Alarms shrieked through the facility. Less than 60 seconds before they were surrounded. Mason sprinted across the training grounds, weaving through the kennels. Inside, the dogs screamed and thrashed against their chains, sensing the chaos. Rocky stayed close, matching Mason's every step, as if they had never been apart. Almost there. Just as Mason and Rocky burst through the gates, a gunshot rang out. The bullet slammed into the truck's door, but Mason didn't stop. He threw the hard drive onto the front seat, ripped the wheel to the side, and the truck roared forward, kicking up dust, leaving behind flashing lights and screaming alarms. Beside him, Rocky panted heavily, but his eyes remained sharp, alert. They had escaped, but Graves wouldn't let this go. Mason Ryan sped down the rough dirt road, his grip tightening on the wheel. In the passenger seat, Rocky lay still but watchful, his breath still ragged from the chase. They had the evidence. Everything Graves had done inside that facility. The neural control program. The tortured dogs turned into killing machines. It was all on the hard drive, now sitting on the back seat. But Mason knew Graves wouldn't let him walk away so easily. Just as he reached an open stretch of road, headlights flared in his rearview mirror. 3 SUVs. Right on his tail. The first one accelerated, veering hard to force Mason off the road. He yanked the wheel, barely missing a steep ditch. Rocky's ears shot up, teeth bared, sensing the danger. "Hang on, buddy," Mason muttered, and jerked the emergency brake. Tires screeched. The truck spun sideways, skidding across the dirt. One of the pursuing SUVs didn't react fast enough. It slammed straight into a tree, bouncing back from the impact. 2 left. Through the rearview mirror, Mason saw a figure step out of the remaining SUV. He had been waiting for this moment. Jonathan Graves. Standing beneath the blinding headlights, his long coat billowed slightly in the wind. His face was exactly as Mason remembered. Cold, calculated, deadly. Graves lifted a hand, a single signal to his men, and instantly, the headlights from the last SUV flared, blasting directly at Mason and Rocky. Mason barely dodged to the side, but Rocky didn't move. The dog stood frozen, unblinking, his body suddenly rigid. Graves had activated the neural control signal. A faint beep cut through the air. And just like that, Rocky snapped to attention. His entire frame locked into place, muscles tense like a machine booting up. Mason felt the shift instantly. Rocky was no longer standing at his side. He was looking at him, but not as a teammate. Graves smiled coldly. "Did you really think you could take one of my dogs without consequences?" He raised a small control device, his fingers gliding over the keypad. "The program was never broken, Ryan. It only takes one command to restart." Rocky shuddered, his eyes widened, pupils contracting. And then, he turned to Mason. Not as a teammate, not as a loyal friend, but as a target. Mason didn't move. He had seen this look before, back at the facility when Rocky's memories resurfaced. But this time, it wasn't just a memory. He was being forced back into that state. Graves pressed a button, a sharp click. Rocky snarled. Rocky lunged at Mason, but Mason didn't draw his gun. He couldn't. "Rocky, stop." A slight hesitation, but Rocky kept coming. Mason locked eyes with him. "You're not his dog," Rocky blinked, a flicker of doubt. Graves frowned, pressing the button harder. Rocky shuddered, snarled violently. Mason didn't flinch. "Remember, buddy, you chose me, not him." Rocky froze, just seconds before he would have slammed into Mason. And in that split second, his eyes shifted. Mason saw it. And then, Rocky turned. He faced Graves and growled. Graves' expression darkened. "Impossible." Suddenly, Rocky charged straight at him. Graves barely had time to react, stumbling back as Rocky stepped in front of Mason, fur bristling, teeth bared in a deadly warning. Mason let out a cold laugh. "Looks like your program has a glitch, Graves." Graves's face twisted in anger. He snatched the control device and hurled it to the ground. "It doesn't matter. I still control everything." Reaching into his coat, he pulled out a radio. His voice was sharp. "Wipe the facility. No traces left." A panicked voice crackled through the speaker. "But sir, the research subjects—" "Erase everything." Graves cut him off. "If I can't use them, no one will." Mason's stomach twisted. He wasn't just erasing data. He was ordering the execution of every last dog in that facility. Mason lunged for Graves, but the man had already thrown himself into the SUV. The engine screeched to life. The vehicle sped off into the darkness, leaving Mason and Rocky behind. In the distance, flames erupted. The training facility was being wiped out. Mason's fists clenched. Not a chance in hell. He turned to Rocky. The dog's eyes were clear now. No hesitation, no fear. Only one objective remained: save the others. Mason met Rocky's gaze. Then he nodded. "Let's go." Rocky let out a sharp, determined bark, then bolted ahead of Mason. The fight wasn't over. But this time, they weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for every dog that never got the chance to be free. Alarms blared. The glow of small explosions lit up the horizon, turning the night sky into a sea of fire. Dust and smoke billowed from the buildings as the self-destruct sequence activated. Mason Ryan had no time to hesitate. His fists clenched as he turned to Rocky, the only one he could trust right now. "Find the others." Rocky let out a low, fierce growl, then took off into the burning facility. They had to get those dogs out before this place buried them all. Mason raced across the training grounds, weaving through the rows of steel kennels. Inside, the dogs barked frantically, their panic rising as fire and smoke swallowed the compound. He lunged forward, grabbing the first kennel door. Bam! The lock snapped. A black Malinois burst out, landing in front of him. But it didn't attack. It just stood there, waiting. These dogs had been trained differently. They weren't like any canines Mason had ever seen. But that also meant one thing. They still knew how to follow orders. Mason whistled sharply, signaling the Malinois to head for the main gate. Then, he moved to the next kennel. Rocky had already broken off, racing to another section. He lunged forward, teeth clamping down on the chains binding a white shepherd. The dog thrashed, struggling. Then suddenly, it was free. And without hesitation, it ran after Rocky. One by one, they were released. Mason counted quickly, 7, 10, but time was running out. The main training facility had begun to collapse. Flames and smoke billowed, sealing off the main exit. Mason turned to Rocky. "Find a way out, buddy." Rocky immediately reacted. His nose twitched, sniffing the air. Then, in an instant, he changed direction. He bolted right toward a side corridor. Mason didn't hesitate. He ran after Rocky, with an entire pack of war dogs at his heels, all fleeing the hell that Graves had created. Boom! A massive explosion erupted behind them, the shockwave slamming into Mason, sending him flying forward. He hit the ground, hard, dazed, and then a warm muzzle nudged his hand. Rocky. He hadn't run ahead. He had come back, to pull Mason up. Mason gave him a firm nod, then pushed forward. They burst out of the building, just as another explosion tore the entire facility apart. Just as Mason and Rocky burst through the main gates, a wall of headlights from over a dozen vehicles flared to life, illuminating the entire area. Above them, the roar of helicopter blades shook the night sky. Mason squinted. And then he saw him, Cross. Stepping out from one of the SUVs, gun raised. "Everyone on the ground! FBI!" Shouts erupted from the far side of the training grounds. Federal agents stormed in, taking down Graves' mercenaries one by one. Mason slowly lowered his hands. The fight was almost over. But then, he saw him, Jonathan Graves, dragged from the back of an armored truck, wrists cuffed behind him. But that wasn't what unsettled Mason. It wasn't the fact that Graves had been captured. But it was the smirk on his face that sent a chill down Mason's spine. Graves locked eyes with him, tilting his head slightly, as if this had all been just a game. "You think you've won, Ryan?" His smirk widened. Mason said nothing, he just stared. Graves let out a quiet chuckle, then spoke one final sentence before being shoved into the transport vehicle. "This is just the beginning." Then he was gone. Mason stood still. His jaw tightened, his eyes darkened, because his instincts screamed at him. Graves wasn't bluffing. Something bigger was at play. And he had to be ready for the next battle. Even after Graves was taken away, Mason couldn't shake the unease settling deep in his gut. This is just the beginning. Those words echoed in his mind. What if Graves was only part of something bigger? Mason sat in Cross's office at the FBI headquarters, eyes fixed on the computer screen. "What do we have on his organization?" Mason's voice was low, steady. Cross typed rapidly, pulling up a series of classified documents. "We ran through every financial record, every military connection, and every trace of the Rex program. There's no sign of anyone continuing the operation." Mason's brow furrowed. "No one?" Cross leaned back. "If anyone else was involved, they were gone before we got there. But there's nothing to indicate the program is still active." Mason's fist clenched. So, was it really over? He looked down at Rocky, lying at his feet, still alert, still cautious, but no longer tense. Mason took a deep breath, then gave a slow nod. Then it's done. For the first time, he could finally let this go. 4 months later. Since the day Graves's facility burned to the ground, the federal military courtroom was packed. Reporters crowded the hallways, cameras trained on the heavy wooden doors leading inside. Today, the world would finally hear the truth. Mason Ryan stood silently in the courtroom, his sharp gaze fixed on the man being led to the defendant's chair. Jonathan Graves. He was no longer the powerful, untouchable figure he once was. His face was pale, sunken. The sleepless nights in a prison cell had hollowed him out, but that didn't bring Mason any satisfaction. Not yet. Not until justice was served. Defendant Jonathan Graves, former commanding officer of the Rex program, is hereby charged with military ethics violations, animal torture, and illegal experimentation on military canine units. The judge's voice echoed through the courtroom. Behind him, a massive screen flickered on, displaying the evidence Mason and Cross had fought so hard to uncover. Videos of dogs under neural control, reports of military canines being eliminated under suspicious circumstances, classified documents Graves had tried to erase. Everything was laid out, clear as day. Graves sat motionless, expression unreadable. But Mason knew fear when he saw it. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, Graves simply glanced at Mason and let out a quiet, bitter chuckle. "I only did what was necessary to win." A wave of anger burned in Mason's chest, but he didn't react. He wouldn't give Graves that satisfaction, because he had won. After the trial, Mason stood outside military headquarters with Rocky by his side. A group of retired canine handlers and senior officers approached, one of them holding a medal. "Rocky, you're no longer a fugitive." The older colonel smiled, kneeling to fasten the medal onto Rocky's collar. He was no longer an experiment, no longer a weapon. He was a decorated military canine veteran. Rocky didn't understand the significance of it, but Mason did. He had fought, and now he was being honored. As reporters raised their cameras, Mason placed a steady hand on Rocky's head. "You earned this, buddy." Rocky shivered slightly, then gently nudged Mason's leg. That night, Mason sat by the fireplace in his ranch, watching the flames dance in the dim light. Beside him, Rocky lay curled up on an old, worn-out rug. For the first time since Mason had met him, Rocky wasn't flinching at every sound. He was sleeping, peacefully. No nightmares. Mason smiled faintly, reaching down to place a hand on Rocky's back. "You're not a weapon anymore." Rocky lifted his head slightly, those deep brown eyes meeting Mason's, full of trust. Mason gently ran a hand over Rocky's head, his voice low but steady. "Your family." Rocky was no longer a forgotten dog, lost in the shadows of his past. He had fought, endured, and reclaimed his identity. But more importantly, he had found his family. Mason had saved Rocky. But the truth was, Rocky had saved Mason too. Two lost warriors, both drowning in darkness. Now they had found the light in each other. This isn't the story of a broken dog. This is the story of a fighter who never gave up. Rocky's story is just one of many, a testament to loyalty, courage, and the unbreakable bond between humans and dogs. What do you think about Rocky's loyalty and bravery? If you had the chance to adopt a retired military dog like Rocky, would you take it? Tell us in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you believe that every dog deserves a second chance, a loving home, and the chance to be loved in return, subscribe to Dog Stories for more incredible tales of resilience and devotion. We appreciate every single one of your support. Thank you for listening to Rocky's story.